claps and snares. Clap and snares. How do you layer them in drums, music, pop music, for example, but could be any music? There's an important concept, a simple concept, but an important one. I shall explain all in this video. Anyway, this video is sponsored by a new sponsor. It's, oh, sounds like this. Oh, yes. Anyway, more about that in a bit. In fact, I'm using their samples to demonstrate this concept because it's a perfect example, it's perfect synergy of stuff. Brilliant concept and brilliant sample pack even demonstrating the idea. Anyway, let's dive into the knowledge to knowledge up your brain. So if you have a clap landing on the same beat as a snare, remember the snares normally land on the 2s and the 4s, or sometimes the 3s, depending on the BPM you're using. But yes, normally the 2s and the 4s, or sometimes the 3s. If you have a clap landing at the same time, move the clap to the left. As you can see here, the snare is on the beat. Look at the beat markers up there. For example, the .4, or in this case, for example, the .3, or in this case, the .4. You see the snare landing exactly on the beat, but there's a bit of something before it. A little bit to the left is this other thing, and that's the clap. Here's some audio examples from the pack, of course. Notice how even though the clap's technically early, it doesn't sound early. It still sounds on time. It still sounds like the clap is happening on the beat at the same time as the snare, but it's technically happening just that little bit before. This helps the clap stand out, as otherwise it can get a bit lost under the snare. For example, let me show you, in fact, yes, let me do a before and after. Before this offset and then after this offset. I'll show you a few different ways to do this later on. But first of all, before the offset, so the clap happening at the same time as the snare on the beat. And now with this offset. Before, after, before, after. See what I mean? Even without limiting, when the clap happens at the same time as the snare, it generally gets lost. It almost sounds like it's a part of the snare instead of this separate thing, a clap, which, I mean, sometimes it's fine to put it literally on the snare, but normally it's better to move it to the left, to offset it left. So it happens just that tiny amount of time before the snare. Don't go too far though. In fact, let me show you that. If you move the clap too far to the left, it just sounds out of time, obviously. So you want to move it left, but not so far that it sounds out of time or sounds like it's happening before the snare. If you move it just a bit, it will sound like it's a part of the snare still, but move it too far and it'll just sound wrong. And it depends on the situation how far to move it. I mean, well, it depends on the clap and the snare, how far you want to move it. And of course, like many things, there's no exact answer. There's no perfect position. Just generally speaking, you almost always want to do it. And in fact, as you can see in these examples here, it's something everyone does almost all the time. But at the same time, if you're new to production, you just wouldn't think to do this. I mean, I know when I first started producing, I mean, the thought doesn't even cross your mind, does it? I mean, until you've seen it, why would you think to do that? It doesn't make any sense. But now you've seen it, you know, that's the way you want to do, with the way you generally want to do things. It should be your default. The default should be to move it. And then maybe if it sounds wrong, you could always sometimes move it under the snare. But as I say, most of the time it's generally better to the left. Offset, so it happens a little bit before where it's supposed to. It's happening before where you expect it to, before the beat. And before the final tipperoonie, the final tip to implement this sort of thing, let me tell you something about the pack from today's sponsor, Ava, or Ava is the company name, AVA, and the sample pack name is Prism. Focus on quality over quantity. Actually, that's true. So this is that. I was reading that like a joke, reading press release voice, but that's actually true. So oftentimes when people say we focus on quality over quantity, it's nonsense. But this is actually this is actually true. But in this case, it's honestly true. As you'll see, of course, I mean, you've heard in the examples, samples used in tracks culminating in over 100 million views. So they're established samples. They're tried and tested. You know they work. I mean, yes, let's say, for example, mostly pop records, and notably the Shazam and Lego 2 trailer. So that's proof they work. If you're unsure if, say, a snare or a kick will work in all these different situations, this sample pack it'll take that concern away, because you know they'll work. And it is really cool. I really like this concept of quality over quantity. Only having this many kicks and this many snares, for example, knowing that if I want to make a pop track, the pop in the truest sense of the word, not necessarily just pop, dance music pop, I can use these samples. Oh, yes, you get a revolutionary contact interface. So if you have contact, you can load up the contact instrument here and do the drum stuff with that as well. Or you can just use the samples, whatever you prefer. The options are good. Anyway, let's dive into the final concept about the two concepts, actually. Two final things to say. I will say them right now. So now, whilst you can just manually move the clap left, moving it to the left of where it should be, offsetting it relative to the snare. If, say, that's a bit fiddly, or maybe you've got your entire track laid out and you can't figure out a nice way to move all the claps at once, what you could do is use, if you have Ableton, track delays, which you can see here off to the side, which basically delays the entire track forwards or backwards according to the number of milliseconds you select here. So for example, I can move the track left, offsetting the claps to the left using a track delay like this. Therefore, in the arrangement view, the claps will be on the grid at the same time as the snare on the beat. But in reality, they'll happen a little bit before because of this track delay. This track delay just offsets the tracks relative to each other. So that's a different way of working. Sometimes I do it that way, sometimes I do it manually. It's personal preference and it depends. Noting that, in fact, this is an additional trick I just thought of in my brain, or something I probably should have wrote down in my notes. But yes, what you can do, for example, is let's say you have a simple 1-bar loop. You've got the clap offset just perfectly. Well, a nice little workflow trick is to consolidate that into a bar. So therefore, you have this nice bar length thing to work with. So yeah, consolidating writes it out as a brand new audio file. So now you have this 1 bar long block that you can then easily loop or simply duplicate through the track and work with without having to sort of be careful where the claps line up. Because if the claps are very slightly to the left of the snare and there is this tiny clip in the project file, it can be fiddly to work with, and it can also be fiddly to work with if you do this in MIDI. But yes, if you just simply consolidate this as a bar with that perfect offset, then you have this nice big thing to work with, and you can move it about, copy it around the project and not worry about the offset. It's perfectly set. And the final thing I want to say is, I suppose, conceptually, why this works. The reason why this works is sounds that happen extremely close together are generally perceived by our brain to be happening at different times. So for example, if you have think about what a clap is. A clap looks like this. So a clap is a bunch of transients, simplistically. And when you hear this as one sound because those transients are close together. When you hear a layered clap, such as this, you don't hear it as a sequence of sounds. You hear it as one thing because those sounds are happening so close together in the time domain. They're so close together time-wise that you hear it as one thing. And that's conceptually why this works. If you move the clap just a small amount to the left of the snare, it still sounds like the same thing. However, because it is happening before the snare, it gives your brain a chance to hear it. So even though you probably don't hear much of the rest of the clap, once the snare comes in, that's mostly what you're hearing. Because you've heard a bit of the clap before, it almost sets your brain up. It almost tells your brain there's a clap here in this weird subconscious way. I mean, I sometimes like to think about this visually. If the clap and the snare are happening at the same time and the snare dominates the clap, you might not hear the clap at all. But if the clap happens just before the snare, your brain first of all hears the clap, so it registers there's a clap here, then the snare hits, and your brain sort of imagines the rest of the clap, or somehow sort of knows conceptually that there's two things happening here, the snare and the clap. But you can ignore that, of course, because that's just me trying to explain how we understand things. In practice, in terms of actually producing, just remember, by default, always move the clap to the left by just a bit of the snare. Do check out Prism in the link below, probably one of those tracking links, so Ava knows that I sent you there, and they'll be like, yes, Multiplier is the man, he's the best, he's awesome. And that will help, or just type it into Google if you want. But the link below, a bit quicker. I shall catch you guys on the flippity flip.